Okay, so let's get on to the Quran and move my face out of the way of the map. Let me say a couple of things about this map. This is a nice one that is available because it comes very close to the dating or the traditional dating of the Prophet Muhammad's birth, which is, of course, 570. So this is a linguistic map from 560. And just notice all around here, this yellow region is so-called Aramaic Syriac speaking region. It wasn't monolingual, especially in cities, and this is actually helpfully pointed out by these little blue spots. Cities, Greek was still used, but Aramaic Syriac stretched throughout this region. Actually, it stretched even further to the east, but you can't really see it on this map. Okay, let me introduce you to a couple of names which seem to have sort of telltale signs in the Quran that they passed into the Quran from a Syriac tradition. One second. So one of these is a name for Isaac, the son of Abraham. In the Quran, he's named as Ishaq. This does not seem to come from the Hebrew Yitzchak, but rather from the Syriac, which is very, very close, just as that long I sound at the beginning. Ishaq, the name for Pharaoh, the evil Pharaoh, enemy of God and Moses. In the Quran, of course, he's named as Fir'aun. This does not seem to come from the Hebrew word, which is Perao, without that noon at the end, whereas in Syriac, the noon is there, so Per'aun, so it seems to come from Syriac. And there are many, many terms which are suspected by academic scholars of the Quran to have a connection to Syriac. I mean, one of these is the word deen in the Quran. So think of Al-Fatiha, the first chapter of the Quran, which has this reference to Yom ad-Din. Of course, there is the Arabic word deen, meaning religion, but in a phrase like Yom ad-Din, this term seems to mean judgment, and that is exactly what the Syriac dina means, not religion, but judgment. Another word, Qurban, used, for example, to refer to the sacrifice in the allusion to the story of Cain and Abel in Surah Al-Ma'idah or Quran 5, seems to be related to, probably not to the Arabic word where the root seems to mean to draw close, but rather the Syriac word, which Qurbana, which means a sacrifice. Interesting one is Ruh al-Qudus, which is oftentimes translated as Holy Spirit, but actually is a kind of a idafa. Qudus is not an adjective, at least in the syntax or morphology, modifying ruh, so it seems to be more like spirit of holiness. Notice in the Christian Arabic, usually this term is referred to as Aruh al-Qudus. And so anyway, the phrase seems to come and even mirror the construction of Syriac, which is Ruha Qudsha. So this is kind of like a Syriac version of Idafa. So there's that. I mean, the Holy Spirit is associated with Jesus in the Quran, which is interesting, of course. So Christian stuff going on. And then another really interesting one is the Arabic word Furqan, which, is often translated the criterion for discernment or division, from the Arabic word or the root faraqa, which has to do something with division, difference, something like that. But there are places in the Quran where Furqan seems to have some meaning connected to the Syriac mean of a word Purqana, also in Aramaic. But Furqana does not mean division or separation, but rather redemption or salvation. So is the Quran sort of channeling or riffing on that Syriac term? Okay, I'm going to go on to two Syriac legends, which are related to Quranic stories. First is the Companions of the Cave. Allow me for just one moment first to introduce you to this kind of really cool work of art, which you find in this image here. This is by Sandow Birk, who wrote a work or produced a work called The American Quran, in which he set Quranic narratives in scenes from American life. He did this so that non-Muslim Americans would sort of have a way of thinking about the Quran through their own tradition, and also that Muslim Americans would have a way of situating their tradition in the American context. But note this, this illuminated page, which is channeling the story of the Companions of the Cave, Notice that there's a dog here. We're going to get back to the dog, but instead of setting this somewhere in the Middle East, Sandelberg sets this in the Appalachians. I mean, imagine West Virginia, where a coal mine has just collapsed. So they're stuck in this cave with their dog. Okay, so let's get on to the companions of the cave account. This is, of course, in Surat al-Kahf or Quran 18. I mean, a lot has been written about this, and a whole episode could be recorded, sort of taking the story from the beginning to the end. I just want to sort of highlight one element of it, which has an interesting connection to the Syriac legend. But I mean, allow me just to introduce the legend very briefly, which is before the Quran was proclaimed in the 7th century, Christians were already telling the story of the companions of the cave. They didn't call them the companions of the cave, they called them the sleepers of Ephesus, because the city was set in what is today in Turkey, or Turkey, the city of Ephesus. And I mean, so much could be said about the backstory, super, super interesting. Basically, the reason why the story was told is because it is a way of communicating the teaching of the resurrection of the body. The historical setting for the story is that there were these faithful Christians who were persecuted under a pagan emperor. His name was Decius. They fell asleep miraculously in a cave. Fell asleep basically means they died, but then God woke them up when a Christian emperor, Theodosius II, had come to the throne. And the whole thing was a lesson, actually, for Theodosius himself, to show that there really is the resurrection of the body and not only of the souls. Okay, more could be said about that, but the Quran is also interested in the teaching of the resurrection of the body. So it takes this story and proclaims it in its own fashion. Now, interestingly, in this story, there's a dog. So Quran 18:18, speaking about the sleepers or the companions, we turn them over to the right and to left, and their dog stretching its paws at the threshold, etc., etc. So that's pretty interesting, and I just thought I would help you see the backstory to the dog in the Companions of the Cave account, which could be found through Syriac. So the Syriac tradition, which originally proclaimed the story, it's possible there's a Greek antecedent, but it was known principally in Syriac. One of the versions of this is by a scholar we've already mentioned, Jacob of Saruk, who dies in 521, who wrote a metrical homily, or a memra, on the sleepers of Ephesus, in which he has these following lines: "We beg you, good shepherd, who has chosen his sheep, preserve our flock from that wolf who is thirsting for our blood." And then we have a narrative, so that's kind of the prayer of the sleepers, and then the narrative, sort of third-person commentary. He, that is God, took their spirits and raised them up above to heaven, and left a watcher to be guarding their limbs. Okay, so what's going on in this story? In this very early version of the story, this famous gospel image is employed by Jacob, namely Christ as a good shepherd, believers as sheep, and the devil as a wolf who seeks to attack the sheep, is protected by the shepherd, etc., etc. Now, in this story, because of the role of the evil pagan emperor, the wolf is sort of represents Decius. But really important is just noticing this reference to a watcher. So God, Christ, took their spirits and left a watcher. So some, probably in its original version, maybe an allusion to an angelic being to protect them. But if you're going to actually work within the imagery or the metaphor, that is, if you had sheep and a wolf, what would a shepherd assign to watch and protect them? A sheepdog. And we know that this was a common understanding of this story because we have another account by a pilgrim who visited the city of Ephesus, and he heard there about the city, which is called in this account the city of the 7 sleeping brothers and the dog, Viricanus. So the dog's even given a name, who was at the feet of the seven sleepers. So the dog is part of this metaphor, which is a distinctly a Christian metaphor told in a story which is Syriac, and that helps explain why the Quran has a dog in this story. By the way, later Muslim commentators sort of like asked, what is a dog doing here? Some noted that there shouldn't be a dog inside a house because there's a famous hadith which says that angels will not come into a house with dogs, sometimes paintings in them. Dogs are generally seen as unclean. There's sort of ritual washing that has to be done if you touch a dog, but generally should not be in a house at all. So there are different explanations that Muslims try to give to explain, like it's kind of a problem. But now we understand why the dog is there, and the dog is there because of the Christian Syriac origin of this story. Okay, one more account before we get to the famous story of the virgins of paradise, and that is famously the story of Dhul Qarnayn, or the two-horned one, namely Alexander the Great. I know out there on the internet there's controversy. People just don't like that could be Alexander the Great for reasons which are sometimes religious. But I mean, academically, it's just a done deal. Like it's clearly a reference to Alexander. There are just too many connections to the Alexander legends being told by Christians in late antiquity, starting with the representation of Alexander with two horns. And this is a coin representing Alexander, which shows, it's just one side of his face. So you see one of the horns, but this was a common representation of Alexander, and this is taken into the Quran. It's not the Alexander of pagan antiquity, where stuff was related in Greek, where Alexander was a pagan, all this stuff, obviously, connected to Aristotle, blah, blah, blah. The Alexander who gets into the Quran of Dhul Qarnayn is the Alexander of Christian late antiquity, because Christians sort of baptized Alexander and made him have this sort of prophetic role that leads to the coming of Christ, and in some cases the end time scenario involving Byzantine emperors, stuff like that. So let me just first introduce the Quranic passage here, and they ask you about Dhul Qarnayn. Say, I will tell you something about him. We established him in the land. We gave him means of everything. By the way, this is, again, in Quran 18, Al-Kahf. And you get some of the story. He sort of goes to one end of the world, where the sun sets, one place, probably imagining a flat earth where the sun, like this is the actual spot where the sun goes down, and it goes to, the end of the world, and it goes to the northernmost stretches, all of this. Okay, so the real innovation, there were earlier studies of this passage in Surah Al-Kahf in light of the Alexander traditions, but the guy who really sort of nailed it was Kevin Van Bladel, today of Yale University, who wrote this article, or book chapter rather, The Alexander Legend in the Quran, in which he shows that there are intimate connections with one particular work, and there's a bunch of them, so it gets confusing, on Alexander in late antiquity. This work is a Syriac work, Neshana Dile de Alexandros, The Glorious Deeds of Alexander. There's an earlier work called the Alexander Romance. I'm not going to try to sort through all of this. For a long time, it was thought, because of an allusion to an event that's datable in the text, possibly, but it's not kind of explicit, that this text might date right around 629 AD, but more recent studies of Tommaso Tazzei, who's appeared on Exploring the Quran and the Bible, suggest that this Neshana actually dates very likely to the 6th century, so not far from the date of when our friend Jacob of Sarug was writing his works, maybe from the reign of Justinian, could be connected, in fact, in some detail to Justinian. Okay, and there's a lot could be said. Kevin Van Bladel says very provocatively, almost every element of this short Quranic tale finds a more explicit and detailed counterpart in the Syriac Alexander legend. So, that could be a whole nother episode, just going step by step. at how close this Quranic passage is to the Syriac Alexander legend. But here we just want to sort of give examples of how things that might seem peculiar in the Quran, like why do we have a character who's named the guy with two horns? Well, it's because of the Syriac tradition, which again is channeling or baptizing the figure of Alexander the Great and using them for the arguments they're making about world history, the role of Christ, all of this. But in the Alexander legend, explicitly, Alexander is made to call upon God to give him horns. So he prays to God, Alexander, and says, "Oh God, master of kings and judges, you who raise up kings and dismiss their power, I perceive with my mind that you made me great among all kings, and that you caused horns to grow on my head, so that I may gore with them the kingdoms of the world." So much. There's so many other connections that could be made about Gog and Magog, Alexander going to the edge of the world, all of this. But hopefully that's interesting already. It helps you see how the Quran is developing for its own purposes this Syriac legend.